Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 711, and today is November 14th, 2024. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to cover on today's show. You will want to share today's episode of the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. It's reposted on the blog at antiwar.com. You can find it at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee if you would like to watch the show. It's also up anywhere you can listen to podcasts, and you can follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. Let's get into it. All right, we're going to start off today's show, and this is the theme for the most part on today's show once again, and that is the Trump cabinet. And I say, Trump welcomes Hawks back to Washington. I write, President-elect Donald Trump is releasing the names of his new administration via post to Truth Social. The early piss suggests Trump is prepared to make the same mistakes in his second term than he did in his first. So far, Trump has named Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Mike Huckabee as Ambassador to Israel, and Pete Hegseth as Defense Secretary. One of the biggest winners of the appointments is Benjamin Netanyahu. Hegseth has called for the annexation of the West Bank and the building of the Third Temple, and Huckabee has denied that Palestinians even exist. Just after Trump tapped Huckabee for the role, he said, "Of course, there's never been an American president that has been more helpful in securing an understanding of the sovereignty of Israel, and I fully expect that will continue." And this was a suggestion when, the sovereignty of Israel, he's talking about the West Bank. And so this sounds like Huckabee at least suggesting that annexation of the West Bank is a possibility. So if you want to keep up with the Trump appointments and get a lot of details, you could listen to little videos of everything they've said on particularly foreign policy issues. Follow Michael Tracy on Twitter. He is doing an absolutely fantastic job. So the great Michael Tracy points out in the final days of the campaign, Trump was presented as the anti-Dick Cheney candidate and then immediately embraced Dick Cheney's former staff, and that is with Mike Waltz. This is a massive red flag that the second Trump administration will replicate the first. We were promised peace and we will only get more war. And so now let's start talking a little bit more in detail about some of these appointments. Trump officially nominates Ultra Hawk Marco Rubio for Secretary of State. President-elect Donald Trump confirmed on Wednesday that he was nominating Marco Rubio, the extremely hawkish senator from Florida, to be the Secretary of State in the incoming administration. Trump's statement came 2 days after the New York Times reported Rubio was expected to get the job. Politico reported that Rubio's nomination and the appointment of Representative Mike Waltz, a Republican from Florida, as the National Security Advisor relieved Ukrainian supporters in the U.S. who were worried the incoming administration would end the proxy war. Rubio has been in the Senate since 2010 and has been about as hawkish as possible. In 2015, he was the preferred Republican presidential candidate of the neoconservatives, as he supported reckless escalations overseas, such as a no-fly zone over Syria, which risked a direct war with Moscow. During the previous Trump administration, Rubio was very influential in policies in Latin America, including the failed U.S.-backed coup in Venezuela, against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in 2019. That year, Rubio tweeted a picture that showed former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi as he was being brutally killed, suggesting Maduro could face a similar fate. More recently, Rubio has been an outspoken supporter of Israel's genocidal war in Gaza and has called for the U.S. to take a harder line against Iran. After Iran's most recent missile attack on Israel, which came as a response to a string of Israeli escalations, Rubio said, "I urge the reimposition of maximum pressure campaign against Iran and fully support Israel's right to respond disproportionately to this threat. The United States will continue to stand with Israel." Last year, Rubio introduced a bill in Congress that prevents any future president from leaving NATO, which President Biden signed into law. And it's insane that Trump is welcoming Rubio into his foreign policy team, because this bill was explicitly aimed at Trump-proofing the U.S. relationship with NATO in the war in Ukraine. This was meant to tie Trump's hands when he came into office and prevent him from, say, filling out pledges to end the war in Ukraine. And here Trump invites him into the administration. So Rubio has built a reputation for being one of the most hardline China hawks in Congress. In 2020, China placed sanctions on Rubio in a series of U.S. sanctions against officials in Hong Kong. The sanctions may bar Rubio from entering China and could complicate his role as the U.S.'s top diplomat. In 2013, China appointed defense minister who was under U.S. sanctions, and the U.S. refused to lift them. So there's reason to believe, I think, that the Chinese would do the same. Now, I want to break this down a little bit more. And a lot of what I have to say here about Rubio goes for the entire Trump administration. And that is, it's important to understand that when we look at who gets appointed to what position, it doesn't necessarily mean that Marco Rubio is now the man who would say negotiate with the Russians in order to unwind the war in Ukraine. Now, that is the job of the Secretary of State. Don't get me wrong, but how it's really played out in recent administrations is it's just different people have influence in the administration, and then they really take charge. And so we've seen a lot of the negotiations under the Biden administration actually be done by the CIA director, William Burns, because Antony Blinken is no kind of diplomat whatsoever. Additionally, there's positions that have a really outsized role in what they are able to accomplish and the amount of influence they have, like the special envoy to the Middle East role, where Brett McGurk has essentially been able to dictate U.S. policy in the Middle East over the entire Biden administration. Biden ran on making Saudi Arabia a pariah state. McGurk comes in and essentially says we need to bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords and normalize our relationship with Saudi Arabia. And that's been a large part of what the Biden administration has tried to do in the Middle East. Even through the first 8, 9, 10 months of the war in Gaza, the Biden administration's plan was still to bring Israel and Saudi Arabia together under the Abraham Accords, use that to end the conflict in Gaza, right? It was this whole convoluted, stupid plan, but it was being put forward because Brett McGurk had all this power. And so I don't think very much of Marco Rubio, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's a lot smarter than I remember. I watched, the Republican debates in 2015, and my takeaway was Marco Rubio is an idiot. And so I do wonder how much of a role if Marco Rubio ends up getting confirmed, which in Rubio's case, I'm guessing he will get confirmed. There's a lot of Senate decorum, and senators treat other senators in certain ways. And so my guess is that Rubio is able to get through the confirmation fairly quickly. The only thing that I could see hanging up Rubio's entrance into the Secretary of State role would be if there's some kind of logistical voting issues for the Republicans in the Senate. If Trump has a couple more controversial nominees that they're going to lose a couple Republican senator support on, and the Democrats will be lined up against it, they may not be able to have that leg time of whatever it's going to be for the state of Florida to find and appoint a new senator to fill Rubio's role. They're going to maybe need those votes. And so maybe that would hold up his confirmation a little bit, but I imagine that Rubio gets through fairly easily. I think this appointment is going to be, generally speaking, light by the U.S. establishment. And so while, say, the Secretary of Defense is going to get a lot of attacks and a lot of scrutiny and speculation, I think Rubio is going to be able to get through the confirmation process fairly easily. Now, of course, this is Donald Trump. Anybody could fall out of favor with him at any point in time. He likes to hire and fire people, of course. And so, Trump did announce this, so I think it's likely that Rubio does become the next American Secretary of State. But again, this isn't the Biden administration where you could essentially guarantee it at this point. You're 99.9% sure that when he taps Blinken to be Secretary of State as president-elect, that Blinken is not only going to go through the confirmation hearings, no problem, but that he's going to be the Secretary of State probably for 4 years. Trump's first administration, a lot of turnover. So when we look at Rubio, I think if you listen to what he has said on Syria, Iran, the Middle East, Ukraine, even China, none of it is insightful whatsoever. Uh, he is able to repeat the talking points. He could read what they put in front of him. I mean, that puts him steps in front of Kamala Harris, right? That maybe he could even memorize a little bit and repeat it later on. But if you listen to the guy explain it, he doesn't seem to have any real insights or anything that would really help end any of the wars or help him do the job of Secretary of State. And so I wonder if when we end up looking at the Trump administration, maybe Rubio as Secretary of State doesn't have a whole lot of hand in what's going on when we think of U.S. foreign policy right now. What's happening, first the war in Ukraine, then the wars in the Middle East, Israel's wars in the Middle East, and then looking over to China after that. But rather, Rubio is going to lead U.S. foreign policy in South America, and he's going to really crank up the temperature and make that far more aggressive. And so could we see regime change in Nicaragua or Venezuela? I think that's the real risk to Rubio. And in this sense, he's almost worse than Antony Blinken, because at least Blinken is only concerning himself with the wars that we're already fighting. And Rubio seems, very well could open up some new challenges for the Americans in South America. And talk about a policy that would absolutely backfire and create a massive migration crisis. The one thing that Trump has really ran on and seems to have a mandate on is the immigration issue, is the economic issue. It would absolutely blow that up by conducting a major war in South America, or really any kind of regime change operation that would destabilize a major country like Venezuela. All right, now let's talk about the ambassador to Israel, Huckabee. Of course, Israeli annexation of the West Bank is possible under Trump. So President Trump's pick to be U.S. ambassador to Israel, former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, told Israeli media on Wednesday that it was the full Israeli annexation of the occupied West Bank will be possible under the next Trump administration. So Huckabee has close ties to Israeli settler organizations and has long been outspoken about his desire for Israel to annex the West Bank, which he, like the Israelis, called Judea and Samaria. Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, who is in charge of the expanding settlements in the West Bank, recently said that the Trump's election victory provides an important opportunity to annex the territory. He said in 2025 there will be with God's help, the year of sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. I think 2025 is probably too optimistic, but I do see this happening, and I have been saying for several months now, this isn't something I want to happen. It's just how I think things are going to play out. I could yell and say everything I want on the show, but at the same time, I think how things are going to play out is that at some point during the latter half of the Trump administration, Washington signs off on Tel Aviv annexing the West Bank officially. I think through the first few years of the Trump administration, Israel is just going to hit the gas pedal on their de facto annexation move. So it's really already a done deal when Trump says okay to it in, say, 2027, 2028. So the Times of Israel reported this week that Trump's aides have cautioned Israeli ministers in recent months not to assume the president-elect will back Israel's annexation of the West Bank, but the Huckabee appointment is assigned to the administration will be supportive of the move. And look, I think that the Trump team probably has enough PR sense, unlike the current administration, to understand that it would be a bad thing if the Israelis are telegraphing this. And so Trump may say to Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir and Benjamin Netanyahu, you are going to shut your mouths. You are not going to say that you are going to annex the West Bank under my administration. Then in 2027, 2028, you can go ahead and annex the West Bank. You have set up the policy till then, but you can't you can't openly say it. It's just bad PR. For the same reason, I think if Trump takes office, he would go to Tel Aviv and tell Netanyahu that you got to stop your military from posting videos online of them conducting war crimes in Gaza. It's simply intolerable. We cannot allow it. And that's not anything that improves the conditions or the state for the Palestinians. In fact, in some respects, it might make it worse. But at the same time, you could imagine that Trump is at least looking to tighten the noose a little bit on the Israelis to say like, hey, you gotta at least not make the PR problem so bad for me over here, even if you don't actually change the policy whatsoever, where Biden has, allowed the Israelis to just openly conduct their genocide with the full support of the Americans. So in an Israeli army radio interview, Huckabee would not commit to the backing Israeli settlements in Gaza, an idea favored by many Israeli ministers and lawmakers. He said, I don't want to make any comments about the policy because those won't be mine to make. They'll be the president's. It will be my job to carry out the policy he prescribes. And again, I think ultimately the Israelis will do this and the Americans will just more or less sign off on it after. I want to mention here that real estate executive Stephen Witkoff will be the special envoy to the Middle East. Trump posted, Steve is a highly respected leader in the business and philanthropy who has made every project and community he has been involved with stronger and more prosperous. Steve will be unrelenting voice for peace and will make us all proud. As far as I could tell, there's nothing that really stands out to me that makes this guy a particular expert or has any particular positions on the Middle East that would qualify him for this position. And so it's a very Trumpian, I guess, kind of pick. The best qualification he seems to have is that he was supportive of Trump's foreign policy in his first term. So Abraham Accords, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Trump moving the embassy to Jerusalem. These seems to be all things that he likes. Although, again, he doesn't seem to have any particular original thoughts when it comes to Middle East policy. And he was also golfing with Trump during the second assassination attempt on his life. I have no idea if that helped him get the job. All right, next up. Trump pits John Ratcliffe to lead CIA. So President-elect Donald Trump announced Tuesday that he has selected former Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe to serve as Director of the CIA. Ratcliffe worked as Trump's DNI from 2020 to 2021 and was the House Representative for a district in Texas from 2015 to 2020. Back in 2004, President George W. Bush appointed Ratcliffe as Chief of Anti-Terrorism and National Security for the Eastern District of Texas, and he was later promoted to the Attorney General for the district, where he worked from 2007 to 2008. The incoming CIA director is supporter of sweeping government surveillance powers as he lobbied for the extension of 702 of the FISA Act, a law that allows the government to spy on American citizens without a warrant. In 2023, Ratcliffe and several other former Trump officials, including Mike Pompeo and Bill Barr, sent a letter to House Speaker Mike Johnson to support that extension. And remember, Mike Johnson came into the role of House Speaker saying that he wasn't going to support that extension. It was this letter on top of a bigger push against Mike Johnson that ultimately got him to commit to extending that mass surveillance program. Ratcliffe is known as a Trump loyalist for pushing back against unfounded allegations of alleged Russian interference in his role as DNI. Recently, he has been pushing claims about Iran allegedly hacking Trump campaign and plotting to kill the president-elect, a charge that Tehran has strongly denied. Ratcliffe has used the allegations to call for the U.S. to join Israel in taking a harder line against Iran. Ratcliffe is also a China hawk and has called for the U.S. to prepare for a confrontation with Beijing. So next up here, we have Tulsi Gabbard. So she is the new director of national intelligence. Trump pits Tulsi Gabbard for DNI. President-elect Donald Trump announced Wednesday that he has selected former Hawaiian Congresswoman Lieutenant Colonel Tulsi Gabbard to be his director of national intelligence. Gabbard, a member of the National Guard, was in Congress from 2013 to 2021. A former Democrat, she recently announced she was joining the Republican Party and endorsed Trump in his race against Vice President Kamala Harris. Gabbard has been an opponent of U.S. involvement in the war in Ukraine since Russia launched its invasion. She wrote on X, "This war and suffering could have been easily avoided if the Biden administration had simply acknowledged Russia's legitimate security concerns regarding Ukraine and becoming a member of NATO, which would mean U.S. NATO forces right on Russia's border." During a presidential run in 2020, Gabbard made opposing regime change wars essential to her campaign. She staunchly opposed U.S. involvement in Syria and made a trip to the country in 2017 to go on a fact-finding mission. While in Syria, she met with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, engaging in raging hauts in Washington. Gabbard also made clear during her campaign that while she was opposed to regime change wars, she was a hawk when it came to the war on terror. She said, "When it comes to war against terrorists, I'm a hawk. When it comes to counterproductive regime change, I'm a dove." Gabbard has repeatedly claimed that Islamism is a great threat facing the U.S. She recently said Hamas's October 7th attack on southern Israel was a stark reminder of the ongoing short and long-term threat Islamic terror that continues to spread around the world today. Their goal is to establish a global Islamic caliphate where we all must live under their Sharia law. In the wake of the October 7th attack, Gabbard said that the U.S. must stand with Israel. She also smeared members of Congress who have called Israel's actions in Gaza a genocide as apologists and supporters of Islamist Hamas terrorists. During her time in Congress, Gabbard was a staunch critic of Trump's foreign policy, calling him Saudi Arabia's BITCH. I'll spell it out since I usually don't swear on this show, and strongly opposing his support for the brutal Saudi UAE war on Yemen, which she called genocidal. She also opposed Trump's escalations against Iran. One of Gabbard's last acts of Congress was to introduce a bill that would have prohibited the funding of the enforcement of sanctions that inflict suffering on civilian populations around the globe. And so with Gabbard, you get quite the mixed bag, and I think she will be one of the closest people to power that we have had in some time to share views on a lot of these subjects, particularly standing against the regime change wars and standing against the war in Ukraine, which are absolutely crucial and really important. And so I think the other thing that's really important is Ratcliffe, Tulsi, and Matt Gaetz all have, and Matt Gaetz was the appointment to Attorney General, all have one other thing in common. I think they're the three people that are closest to Donald Trump who can actually articulate the Russiagate conspiracy against President Trump, first to tank his election chances, then to try to steal his election victory and throw it to someone else, and then finally to undermine his presidency and try to get him impeached. A coup. Multiple coups against the sitting president occurred during this Russiagate conspiracy. I think there's very few people in the Trump orbit, maybe Kash Patel is another, that actually have some understanding of what this was, how big the conspiracy was. And unlike Donald Trump, if he does understand it, they will be able to articulate it. You know, anytime you had Donald Trump try to explain something, he'll say, you know, they tried to steal the 2016 election from me, but then he'll go on, sorry, we ran a beautiful campaign. It was one of the greatest campaigns ever run. Hillary was terrible. And by the time he actually gets back to Russiagate, both him and the audience are too sidetracked to really have an idea of what's going on. And so this is, I think, good news, especially because with Tulsi, she has been smeared as a Russian agent, and in serious ways. They've really gone after her for being an agent of the Kremlin when there's absolutely no evidence for it whatsoever. And so maybe she'll have a real axe to grind on this issue, and we could get some, documents that affirm and make it undeniable the conspiracy of Russiagate, which what breaks down a lot of what the war state has done. And so I do think that is absolutely massive if Tulsi were to do that. So that's the good. The bad is the Hawks. The good is Tulsi, Matt Gaetz, and at least Ratcliffe on Russiagate, although, generally speaking, he's a negative. All right, next up here, this is an article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on November 12th. Russian nuclear weapons are keeping NATO troops out of Ukraine. A top military official said that NATO forces would have deployed to Ukraine to drive Russian soldiers from the country if Russia did not have nuclear weapons. So, chair of the military committee, Dutch Admiral Rob Brouwer, explained to the International Institute for Strategic Studies Prod's defense summit in the Czech Republic that Russia's nuclear weapons are deterring a NATO deployment to Ukraine. Quote, I am absolutely sure if the Russians did not have nuclear weapons, we would have been in Ukraine kicking them out. Brouwer said the challenges for the West is finding where Russia red lines on nuclear weapons are, noting that Washington mistakenly miscalculated that sending tanks and F-16s to Ukraine were Kremlin red lines. And I think he really misunderstands the situation, because Moscow certainly has continued to ramp up its war, the intensity, the amount of civilian targets that it's willing to hit, as the West has dumped more and advanced weapon systems into Ukraine. But Brouwer pretends there was never a red line, and we should have just started sending the F-16s right away. Admiral Brouwer was discussing the differences between the Ukraine conflict and other NATO wars, such as the Afghan occupation. He stated the main difference between Moscow and Kabul is Russia's nuclear stockpile. In Afghanistan, American and NATO forces quickly forced the Taliban from Kabul in 2001. Then Western allies engaged in a 2-decade nation-building project while the Taliban fought using insurgent tactics. The top NATO official went on to say the Afghan war was not of strategic importance. And this is a very important omission that just completely goes unnoticed everywhere. But NATO said the Afghan war was never important. So Afghanistan was never of strategic importance. If we're really honest, Afghanistan was not of strategic importance. We spent 20 years there and we did a lot of things and people lost their lives. But if you ask the question, was it of strategic importance in Afghanistan? The answer is no. Brouwer also argued that Ukraine is strategically important to NATO because the bloc is defending the rules-based international order. While the alliance has denounced Moscow for invading Ukraine, it has been silent as its core member has lavished Israel with arms as it conducted a genocide in Gaza and invades Lebanon. And so there are a couple potential major and concerning escalations that we could see in the coming days regarding the war in Ukraine. This would happen during Biden's lame duck period. So first up here, UK's Starmer to urge Biden to release $20 billion for Ukraine and back long-range strikes inside Russia. This one from Dave DeCamp, November 12th, antiwar.com. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is planning to urge President Biden to release $20 billion for Ukraine and back long-range strikes in Russian territory before President-elect Donald Trump is inaugurated on January 20th. The $20 billion Starmer wants Biden to release is the U.S.'s share of a $50 billion G7 loan that will be provided to Ukraine and paid back using frozen Russian central bank assets, a step that will mark a significant escalation in the West's economic war against Moscow, and as I've explained on this show, is going to require the Russian assets to remain frozen for a decade, if not more, which means likely that this conflict is going on in the minds of the West, if right now, for a decade longer. I mean, this is really, really important. So Starmer is looking to hold a face-to-face meeting with President Biden next week at the G20 summit in Brazil. He's expected to ask Biden to give Ukraine permission to use British-provided Storm Shadow missiles to launch long-range strikes inside Russia, a step Vladimir Putin has made clear would risk nuclear war. Starmer spoke with the French president on Monday, and the two leaders discussed the possibility of getting the U.S. to support the long-range strikes in Russia. France has provided Ukraine with its version of the Storm Shadow missile, known as the Scalp. Both variants have a range of 155 miles. The Telegraph previously reported that Starmer and Macron were planning to thwart the incoming Trump administration from scaling down U.S. support for Ukraine. They are hoping somehow that NATO-supported long-range strikes in Russia could help achieve that. And I think, in a sense, they are right that Trump is, I think, unlikely to sign off on many major escalations once he takes office. However, if they're already in place, I think that would make it more likely that Trump would just continue it, right? So it's not ramping up, it's just keeping it in place. And then one more story here today. This one I wrote yesterday for the Libertarian Institute. Ukraine believes White House will greenlight long-range strikes in Russia. So a top Ukrainian official walked away from a meeting with Secretary of State Antony Blinken, believing that the White House would approve Kiev using American missiles to strike deep inside Russia. The Ukrainian foreign minister met with Blinken in Brussels on Wednesday. He said, "We discussed the issue of long-range strikes and Euro-Atlantic integration, and here we are also cautiously optimistic." A statement from the State Department spokesman Matthew Miller on the meeting did not mention authorizing long-range strikes, but did say Blinken reaffirmed that Ukraine would one day join NATO. Quote, "The secretary underscored the United States' support for Ukraine as it defends itself against Russia's aggression and continues on its irreversible path to full Euro-Atlantic integration, including NATO membership." After Donald Trump won last week's election, the Joe Biden administration announced it would rush $6 billion in weapons to Ukraine that Congress previously funded before Trump took office in January. And as I said, this is going to create a major crisis, which a Washington invented crisis for Trump to deal with as soon as he takes office. They'll say, "We're out of funding for Ukraine. We need to pass it right away. We got to get more arms to our Ukrainian partners. Ukraine is losing on the battlefield because they don't have the arms they need." And of course, all propaganda. However, President Trump, who I think his main issues and the main issues for the people who voted for him were economics and immigration, may not be willing to spend political capital on fighting another massive military aid bill to Ukraine when he could just sign off on that deal, believe he could deal with Ukraine later, and then get done the immigration and the economic stuff he wants. You know, Washington, the deep state cretins, even those in the Democratic Party, are probably more than happy to trade away their values on domestic issues if Trump caves to their warmongering and their weapon sales. So Trump's election has created some panic among Western leaders that he will bring an end to the proxy war in Ukraine. However, shortly after Trump won the election, he spoke with Ukrainian President Zelensky on the phone, leaving the Ukrainian leader feeling reassured. Still, NATO members have worked with Biden to Trump-proof Washington's massive support to Ukraine in order to prevent Trump from bringing that conflict to an end. And so, Ukraine is going to have a pile of, $6 billion in American weapons. They'll probably have some American weapons that are already promised to Ukraine that I doubt Trump will stop from already going. So anything already bought for Ukraine under the Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative, that I would guess will continue to flow to Ukraine for the coming months, really until some kind of deal is worked out with Russia. Even if it's coming from the Biden era, my guess is that Trump just continues to send it. And then Ukraine is also going to have that $50 billion loan. And I really doubt that Trump is going to say to the Ukrainians, you can't use that money to buy American weapons. I think he's going to very much welcome them buying American weapons with that money. And so there's a real possibility that that this war has at least been Trump proofed for a year or so. Now, there are realities on the ground that Ukraine might have to contend with that are really outside of how much support the U.S. gives to Ukraine. Do they have enough young men to keep fighting? And does the West have enough weapons to give them to keep fighting are the two major questions. So in my article here, I also mentioned that while in Brussels, Blinken also met with new NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. America's top diplomat explained that Biden will use his final days in office to, quote, continue to shore up everything we're doing for Ukraine, adding President Biden fully intends to drive through the tape and use every day to continue to do what we have done for these last 4 years, which has strengthened this alliance. All right. I know a lot happening in Gaza, and I haven't spent enough time covering that this week. I will spend some time on tomorrow's show trying to cover some of the events in Gaza from the past week. The horrors have continued. It's not that anything is improving. It's just I've been really trying to cover this Trump stuff as it comes out. I think it's really important. And with Trump, we could continue to fight, continue to demand that, our senators don't vote for the confirmation of Marco Rubio, push the Trump team to find somebody else to move on from Marco Rubio. That would be huge. Mike Huckabee is obviously another really big problem, Elise Stefanik, and there's a lot more appointments still to come. So there's a lot of fighting to still do there, and that's going to have implications for, the next couple of years. Maybe not the next 4 years, but the next couple of years at least of who gets these positions in the Trump administration. So I will get to the Gaza stuff later this week, though. Anyways, everybody, thank you all so much for tuning in. Back with one more show this week.